welcome to a special bonus edition of the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am chief economist at American Compass, and we are just running nonstop this week in the aftermath of the election. We have for you now, to close it out, a fantastic conversation with Batya Ungar-Sargon, friend of the pod, writer time to time at American Compass. She had a wonderful piece for us up just now called Revolt of the Normies, and has been, I think, just doing a phenomenal job on all her work, kind of really bringing forward the perspective of the Trump voter and what it is that motivates people to support him and what it is they would now be looking for in a new Trump term. Of course, one of the fascinating things about this election is that the term Trump voter itself does not mean what it once did, and that's something that we get into a bunch. We reflect back on interesting lessons learned from the closing stretch of the campaign, from the exit polls, what it might mean for American politics going forward. But then I think really importantly, spend a lot of time now on what's going on at the start of the transition. What is the upside or as I like to call it, the ceiling for a Trump term? What is the downside or the floor? And what are the factors that are going to determine where in between we probably land? So I think you'll really enjoy that heading into the weekend. Also, please do go check out the Commons at American Compass. We've been continuing to publish a lot of really interesting commentary on the election, both Batya's piece, a wonderful one from Duncan Braid, one from Patrick Brown. And of course, if you are not subscribed to Understanding America at this point, frankly, I'm tempted not to let you. But the team tells me we should just keep on leaving it open. The more the merrier, so head on over. I'll have one more rundown on what to read from this past week as we close out the week. That is at understandingamerica.co. But for now, enjoy the conversation with Batya and have a great weekend. And we are joined by Ms. Batya Ungar-Sargon. How are you, Batya?
Thank God, very well. How are you, Oren? Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. I think we are probably both almost podcasted out from our week, but I was like, but I will get to do one with Batya. That'll be the interesting one. So hopefully you're ready to bring it.
I am ready.
Obviously, a lot to talk about. We are now a few days out from the election. I think reality, whether one considers it good or bad, has set in, and we are moving into what actually comes next. I have been impressed and encouraged by how quiet and smooth and reasonable everybody beyond the nuts on Twitter seem to be taking it. It, all things considered, appears to be a wonderful credit to American democracy. What are your initial impressions of where we are?
You know, one of the things I really prayed for was that whoever won would win by a large enough margin that it would go smoothly and be a credit to our democracy. So I feel elated about that part of it. I think that the grace with which Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have lost is heartening as well. I think one of the most underreported stories is the fact that Harris raised 3 times as much as Trump did and spent more than that. She's in debt. And he still won both the popular vote and the electoral college and a clean sweep of all swing states, which is just unbelievable. I mean, even if you hate Trump, you should feel so buoyed by that in terms of what it means about the health of American democracy. He did the same thing to Nikki Haley in the primary. Haley outspent him 2-1. The entire Republican donor class lined up behind her, and he just ran away with it. So to me, the health of our democracy, the reflection of the will of the electorate in the outcomes is just unbelievably heartening and makes me feel really optimistic and excited about the future. I think that the conversation around why he won is missing the mark a little bit. It's very focused on the things that the elites either liked or didn't like about him. So you have a lot of people saying, you know, either excitedly or begrudgingly admitting that he was a sort of finger in the eye of the woke overreach, the transgender women in women's sports or in women's bathrooms, people calling people racist, cancel culture, all of this stuff that the elites really hate. And I think that's probably explains why some rich people voted for a Republican for the first time in their lives. But this is, of course, not why, the majority of Hispanic men voted for him. They voted for him because they felt he had a compelling plan to restore the American dream for working class Americans. And so this really was the election that I think revealed the truth that you and I have been writing about for so long, which is that the real divide in this country is the class divide. We've broken our contract with the working class, and they're not going to stand for it anymore. And they've come together in this very united way to say, this is our guy, let's see what he can do.
Yeah, and that's, I think, exactly what we should dive in on is the what can he do, what will he do, sort of what is the ceiling, what is the floor on what we could expect from the administration. The one other point I just wanted to pick up on as I kind of look back on the results, it's so encouraging to see the depolarization of the electorate along all of these identity lines that we've been told we have to polarize on for so long. It's also striking to see the breadth and in a sense, obviously it's not a consensus. There's still a huge amount of division and disagreement, but the trends are so common, for instance, nationwide, like that map that shows all the red arrows pointing, to the right in the same way, underscores that, because of our electoral college, we have swing states, but this wasn't just an election sort of fought in the swing states. This was a nationwide shift across pretty much every demographic group, including those that are assumed to be the ones that are totally inaccessible to Trump, across regions, across urban, suburban, rural. And so in that respect, I think it is still a narrow outcome, but it feels almost more landslide-ish in that clearly something shifted in the country, and this is what the majority of people, with all, fully informed of the choices, have said they want to move forward with. And I think that provides a pretty good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. He got a lot of mockery for holding a rally in the Bronx. And now you look and he swung the Bronx 22 points toward him. So yeah, he's not going to win New York. But that is huge. I mean, that is really, really significant. And I think what that reflects is he showed up because he felt confident that he had a winning message, and he felt confident that he could face down these populations that he had been told hate him and think he's racist and what have you. And he said, no, I'm going to show up and they're going to see that I love them and I want the best for them. And that's exactly what happened. It was one of his best rallies. You could tell that he was sort of the best version of himself. The rambling tended to go in the direction of him trying to offer advice to like young men of color about how to pick a good business model. And that is a real lesson for Republicans, I think, going forward, is like, first of all, you have to love the people. I mean, that is really what the left is being repudiated over, is they do not love their own voters. They hate their voters. They have total contempt for them, and they thought they could pull one over on them, throw out 14 million of their votes, elevate somebody that everybody knew and pretend that we didn't, and that they would just go along with this. And you really do get the sense that Trump loves this country and loves especially the people who vote for him. But he was willing to go places that regular Republicans who are not him never show up, and they never go. And the lesson here is like, show up. You might not win the state, but my God, to swing New York 22 points in your direction, like that's really significant. And like you said, it gives this larger feeling of a mandate to lead because it is this nationwide phenomenon.
And it is a step in a longer journey. I mean, to me, the craziest result is not just that, New Jersey is now a swing state going into the next election, but New York and Illinois were both closer than Florida or Texas.
Crazy.
You even literally at the start of election night, people wanting to see how narrow would the margin be in Texas. It's like, right. That's not just that's not the story. That's not where the movement is. And to your point about, I think the young black men point is actually something especially interesting to me. And young non-white men in general, because I think Latinos were definitely and actually Asian voters, a significant part of the story as well. We put out a report on this actually just before the election because it was so clear that something was happening, where you had it was in our data. We hadn't really looked for it until we suddenly saw the Harris campaign panicking over their total inability to reach young women. I think for me especially was, Obama got up and give that speech sort of saying like, it must be because you hate women that you're not supporting her. Like, what is going on? And so we went back and looked at a survey we'd already done and found that this group of young non-white men were exactly split between the two candidates, and 20% of them were still undecided or, other unsure. And so it was this 40, 20, 40 group a month out from the election that everyone would have just said is just in the Kamala column historically. And what you saw, to your point about how, Trump could get up on a stage in the Bronx and speak to them, was just the total inability of the entire Democratic Party to say anything to them at all. You had sort of Barack Obama just lecturing them. You had, Harris put out this 5-point opportunity agenda for black men, and like one of the points was about cryptocurrency, one of the points was legalizing weed. Then they like put Tim Walz out there to play a video game with AOC, and I guess neither of them knew how to play, and they gave up without scoring a point at halftime. And then for me, the most fascinating part was what happened if you looked right down the stretch, the sort of last week. They gave up on even trying to speak to this group. It was like, okay, clearly we have nothing to say to them. We're not even going to try. And the closing message, which you heard from Michelle Obama, which you saw from Tim Walz, was literally, men, this is about the women in your life. You have the obligation to cast their vote for them. I'm trying to think if that has ever happened in Democratic politics, where a group that a campaign knew it had to win just conceded, we literally have nothing to say to you. We are going to ask you to vote on behalf of someone else who we think who likes us better. And I think you've even seen from the non-crazy people in the aftermath of this, the start of a recognition that this represents a meaningful kind of shattering of the identity politics narrative around which the so-called, Obama coalition of the ascendant was supposed to prevail.
Yeah, 100%. The campaigns superimposed a gender divide onto the class divide, which of course makes sense because women are 15 points more likely to have a college degree, which means that in the economy that the Democrats created, which is an upward funnel of wealth from the working class to the college educated, basically we're taking money from men and giving it to women. And as women have gotten rich, the identity politics allowed them to keep pretending that they were the oppressed class, which is what this sort of fake abortion ban that Kamala Harris effectively ran on, which, I call it fake because Trump promised he would veto a national abortion ban many times. So they ran on this abortion ban that was never going to happen in order to allow rich women to pretend to be an oppressed class. And meanwhile, Donald Trump ran on the disappearing American dream for the working class, largely working class men who can no longer afford to feed a family on a single income. So you had this bizarre thing where the gender divide was masking the class divide. And the Obamas went out there berating men of color, black men, saying, you got to show up for your women for this fake problem. And what ended up happening was working class women showed up for their men, who had been abandoned by this country, and said, you know what, that's not okay. I mean, you cannot have a society in which the men are just totally, depressed, cut out of the labor force, have nothing to bring to the table, whereas women are on the ascendancy. We're looking down a disaster if we continue with the Democrats' preferred model, where, women graduate from college. Women who graduate from college are increasingly, 75% of them say they're liberal or very liberal. The numbers are not like that for men, but also men are not going to college at the same rates, and women now will not date people who vote for a different party and don't want to date people who don't bring some sort of, economic stability to the table. So you're going to have a situation where we're already really there, where we're having, in my community, in the Jewish community, we call it a shidduch crisis, which means a matchmaking crisis where men and women are not going to be able to partner up anymore. You see this on steroids in the Black community for a host of reasons, but this is a disaster. You can't have a civilization in which people can't find partners. And what happened in the Democratic Party was you had these economic policies that were disastrous for men. So NAFTA, which shipped 5 million very good paying factory jobs overseas to build up China and Mexico's middle class. These were jobs that relied on physical intelligence, on brawn, on masculinity, machismo, that gave men who had those qualities a stable middle class life. Okay, those are gone. And then they opened the border and imported 15 million people just over the last 4 years to work primarily in janitorial services, construction, agriculture. So further depressing the wages and the psychological dignity and self-esteem that an American would get working in those jobs, because now it's considered that those are jobs for an immigrant, for a non-American citizen. And what the Democrats did at the same time was they developed this language around toxic masculinity to where it was now considered poisonous for a man to object to losing the ability to feed his family. I mean, it's very sinister. I don't mean it in a conspiratorial way. I just mean that it's not an accident that these two trends happened in concert. And of course, at some point, we're very lucky to have men who are proud enough to say, actually, we're not going to just keep voting for, our own dispossession. To want to reclaim the mantle of masculinity. And honestly, women want that. I mean, you can't have a society in which people cannot partner up along these roles. I'm not saying it has to go back to the 50s or what have you. I'm not saying we have to kick women out of the workforce. What I am saying is that the left created an economy that made women on the ascendant and men on the decline. And this is an absolute disaster and has to have some kind of fix. And when I was in Kenosha for the debate was in Kenosha? I can't remember which were because I went to the conventions. I think it was the debate was in Kenosha. Yeah. And I was going home from, there was this big watch party with Braver Angels, this amazing organization that brings together Republicans and Democrats. And my Uber driver back to the hotel was this big African-American guy. And, I asked, so did you watch the debate? He's like, no, I've been driving, but I'm going to watch it as soon as I get home. All my friends are texting me, they're like, Biden's really messing up. And I said to him, who are you voting for? And he went, Trump, like that. And he was like, me and all my friends, we're all going to be first-time Republican voters. And I was like, tell me why. And he was like, we're just sick of not being able to make any money, and we're sick of feeling bad about ourselves for being men. And that was it. That is the election in a nutshell.
And I think the point about women coming out for men actually is such an interesting one, because this was another one of these crazy, who is this for moments down the stretch when they started running these ads of the women being forced by their husbands to vote for Trump, but they were going to wink, you can secretly let us tell you about the secret ballot, which allows you to pretend you're a Trump voter and still vote for Harris. And it was such a weird, affluent, progressive woman sort of dystopian fantasy about what I guess they think the rest of the world is, that clearly had no ability to change a single vote except against them, I guess. And then in fact turned out to be exactly the opposite of what happened, as you said. And it's such a, I'm glad you sort of called out this sort of other side of the phenomenon, which is it is this affluent, liberal, female cohort that defines the progressive coalition at this point, and that somehow expects everybody else is just sort of agrees with them, I guess. And this is in the report I mentioned, it's called The Young Men Up for Grabs. This is exactly what we did. We pulled out 3 specific segments of voters: the white working class, young non-white men, and affluent liberal women, and just said, let's see who actually agrees with who on here. And unsurprisingly, it was the affluent liberal women who were the odd women out. I wouldn't want to offend them by saying odd men out. That's the sort of thing that I expect to be very triggering. And I think it's important to say, look, they're entitled to their views as well. It's just important to know what, to not be so bubbled that you don't understand where that does or doesn't fit into the nation. And it seems like that's sort of where at least the left is stuck for the moment. We'll see if this is the wake up call or not. But I do want to get to the substantive point you're making about sort of what it is that Trump is promising and what the appeal is, because I think, as you have made the case better than anyone else, I think there is this sort of coherent narrative here that people are responding to. It's not grievance or xenophobia, or no, it's an actual diagnosis of what has gone wrong, and a set of policies focused in part on trade and on immigration, but also on the deregulation is a traditional Republican talking point. It's also a vitally important element of being able to build things again and creating that prosperous physical economy. There's the sort of moving away from the college model and providing other pathways into the workforce. There is the cultural side of it, which isn't some sort of culture war to look up, to look down upon. It is both independently important and intimately related to the economic piece of it. It's not these sort of two separate lanes. So if you were to kind of make the best case for, okay, the election is over, we are now in the transition. You have all of these voters who were, in essence, the swing voters who have given him this chance now to do something. What is the something? What is the sort of, the day one agenda, the 100-day, not the set of executive orders, but here's what it looks like to actually go out and show that you are delivering on how does Trump say it? Promises made, promises kept.
So I'm, of course, very curious what you think about this as well and the chances of this happening. I think the number one imperative is secure the border. One of the things you taught me is that labor is like everything else. It adheres to the ironclad law of supply and demand. The more you have of something, the cheaper it is, and the less you have of it, the dearer it is. And we want American workers to have an economy that they work in, which supplies them with a living wage and the most modest version of the American dream. So first, you have to protect like the supply of labor, and then I think you have to protect the products of labor. So supply of labor is through immigration controls, and the product of labor is through tariffs. So I think if he, probably day one, we'll see some version of the 3 executive orders that he issued the first time around that were so effective at securing the border. He's promised mass deportations. These are very popular. They are very popular with Hispanic voters. So I think, I wonder if he will have the stomach for what that's going to look like. In Brooklyn, there are hotels full of migrants who came here in the last 4 years. I don't think it would be so difficult to, engage in deportations of people like that, certainly of criminals. But I think that will have a very big impact. I think it had a really big impact the first time around in 2019. For example, the bottom 25% of wage earners saw a 4.5% wage increase compared to the top 25% who only saw a 2.9% wage increase. Which is why I say, I think the data bears out that Trump was the first president in 60 years to shrink the income gap. But I think that was because of the trade policies, but also the immigration policies. He limited this limitless supply of low-wage labor. So to me, that's the first thing. That's a very easy thing, and I think that will have a very, very immediate impact. The second thing would be to look at, trade. The USMCA is up for renegotiation, and I think that they could go even further with that. Trump has said, conflicting things. He said, we're going to get a lot of money from tariffs, but he's also said, tariffs are a starting point for negotiations. And with places like, Japan or Germany, he tells this story about how he once said to Angela Merkel, Angela, why are there no Chevys, on the streets of Berlin? He's very bothered by this. But, there's this is great. This is really important stuff. And if he's going to make good on that, that's really important, I think. I think one of the most historic things he did was make a big play for union voters and union households. And he I think came 44% at the end of the day of union workers, 54% of Ohio union workers. I mean, these are really good numbers. I think he feels very positively toward unions. He has a great relationship with Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union. So I think that, I don't think we're going to see the kinds of things that were predicted about labor. I mean, I don't think he's going to pass the PRO Act or anything like that, but I do think that this sort of having an administration that is both Republican and positively inclined toward unions is, I think, important symbolically, but also legislatively. So I would say that those are sort of the top things that I'm looking at now and hoping to see and hoping that he doesn't sort of backtrack on. Where are you in terms of what you're hoping to see? What is the ceiling for you and the floor for you? And where between that ceiling and floor do you think we are?
Well, I agree totally with the list. I think, the thing I would add to it probably is on the education front. It's something that doesn't tend to top anybody's campaign rallies, but certainly something we find in our polling, the sort of entirely deserved attack on the higher education cartel, and conversely the commitment to alternative pathways to building a decent life is, however we do it, whenever we do it, the single most popular message, the single most popular set of policy proposals across the spectrum. And I also think just an incredibly and important and positive element of the agenda, because I think everything you described on immigration and trade is very important. I think if your sort of message and agenda is kind of entirely, here are the things we're going to stop, here are the things we're going to restrict, here are the things we're going to keep out, that's part of making a market work. But I think you want to have along with that and here's what we're actually going to build. Here's the support we are going to provide. Here's the ways we are actually going to equip American workers to succeed. And given how conversely wildly unpopular and rightfully so the higher education system is, kind of taking that on as a piece of it, I think is very much worthwhile. So I hope that's in there too. The kind of the floor and the ceiling, as I've been thinking about it, are frankly very far apart. It's a Parisian ballroom of administrative. I don't know. Do Parisian ballrooms even have high ceilings? What's something with a really high ceiling?
A cathedral.
A cathedral. Thank you. I was going to say an astrodome. I was going to go in the sports direction, but whatever it is, there's a huge gap here, I think, compared to what you would have with a typical incoming administration. And part of that comes down to Trump himself being someone who obviously has a lot of conflicting impulses on some of these topics. I mean, I think on trade, he sort of is most instinctively committed to one route. Although, even there, to your point, there's always the rumbling like, are we actually going to do tariffs, or are they just a negotiating strategy because he, doesn't like getting taken advantage of and wants a better deal? I think it's really important to recognize that there are absolutely negotiations to be had, but tariffs are actually going to have to be a fundamental part of the American economic policy regime going forward, just given the way our global economy works. So, hopefully that is a firm element. Immigration is another example where I think a lot of the things you outlined in terms of enforcement, in terms of maintaining a tight labor market, are exactly the place to focus. But again, while Trump is always very strong on the enforcement, every now and then you'll hear it come out, but he also wants to greatly increase immigration. Very enthusiastic about temporary worker programs because, who else is going to work in the fields or at his clubs. And so that's another one where I think you could see it go different ways depending on sort of a little bit what he's focused on, a little bit, what is the narrative and message that he's driving. Obviously on labor also, he's very effective in speaking on behalf of and advancing the interests of workers. He's obviously also very anti-union and enjoys laughing it up with Elon Musk about, taking away workers' rights. And so on all of these fronts, this is why I say we are in the cathedral, and probably, especially over the next couple of months, where the rubber will meet the road is on appointments. Because, there is one world, and very different from 2016, there is now a list of very good, capable, talented, prepared leaders who can carry forward the kind of agenda you were just describing. There is also a big pile of CEOs who could come in and kind of run a, typical Republican pro-business playbook. And, I think this is one of the reasons why having JD Vance on the ticket was so important. That's the first personnel decision, which itself signals a direction and then also ensures that is a voice in the room for all of the other decisions. But, looking at, what's going to happen at Treasury, what's going to happen at Labor, those kinds of appointments are going to be hugely important. And, we will see the early coverage, I think, leans probably significantly further to the business buddies side than one would ideally want. That, certainly, as I say, whenever I'm talking about, I have aspirations for what Trump could be. That is rarely a prediction of what he will be. I don't know that anyone has ever made money focusing on predicting what he will do. But I guess, I'd be very curious in your mind then, where is there room for give and take? What are the sort of non-negotiables that you have to get right, and what are the things that, like, look, if he wants to go and do a bunch of cryptocurrency stuff, like whatever, that's fine too. What is a plausible equilibrium that you think is still a good outcome at the end of the day?
I think a lot about like Scandinavia and how low their corporate tax rate is, and how they have this sort of pro-business, strong safety net mentality. I don't think that's exactly right for us, but I don't think it's necessarily the case that every pro-business decision is inherently antithetical to the working class. So I do think it is a balance. I think he really wants a strong economy, and that might be why he's cozying up to his sort of business buddies. He doesn't want anybody freaking out that he's going to take away their labor, but I think he does intend to really restrict immigration. He wrote an op-ed for us. At Newsweek about a month ago.
Yeah, it
We
was
ran
really
an op
interesting.
It was really interesting. So let me put it this way. We ran an op-ed by Donald Trump at Newsweek based on a speech he gave about the economy. And he made a few really interesting promises there. He did the usual no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. Those would be cool. I think that those are, they make people feel seen, which is very significant. And I think with the price of housing in Nevada, for example, in Las Vegas, like this would go, I don't know how long away it would go, but it would make people feel much better about the economy. He promised to lower the corporate tax rate for any corporation that reshores manufacturing from 21% to 15%. And he said he's going to appoint a manufacturing czar to travel the world and entice American businesses to come back here. Those are really great ideas. It's not that we're going to get every single manufacturing job back, but I really agree with JD Vance on something I'm sure he learned from you, which is that we simply should not accept it as a fait accompli that production and manufacturing doesn't happen here. These are jobs, these are great jobs that give people a lot of dignity. You talk often about the myth of the job that the American worker won't do. There is no industry in America that has more illegal workers or immigrant workers in it than native-born American workers in it, and that includes agricultural.
Yeah.
That includes service industry jobs. It's just a myth. And so I think to the extent that he makes good on those promises, I think I think there's a lot to be hopeful about. And I kind of like that he has one eye on the labor issues and one eye on, but we can't tank the economy.
Yeah.
He's very worried about being a president during a recession. I mean, I think that's sort of his greatest nightmare. So on the one hand, like when I hear you say that, my heart sinks a little bit. But on the other hand, one wants somebody who is pro-capitalism, who is pro-growth, who does understand that a strong economy can coexist with great conditions for workers. It doesn't have to be what we have right now, which is that the stock market is booming and American working class people are just like can't afford groceries, you know? It doesn't have to be like that. So I think that in a way, and maybe this is totally Pollyannish and we're going to meet in 6 months and do this conversation again, and I'm going to feel like I have a lot of egg on my face, but I think it doesn't have to be a trade-off. It doesn't have to be an either or. And I think that's really how working class people see it. Like, they don't begrudge the rich people who also got a tax cut in 2017 because they feel like they got a tax cut, you know, and probably jobs were good and wages were up because of those tax cuts for the rich as well. So I think, but when I hear you talking about, you know, the tax cuts for the rich, I think like, no, this is Polly. If Oren is against them, like, surely like that is another one of the lies that the economists are always telling us. So I guess we'll see.
Well, I mean, I think you put it very well, which is that, and it's an important distinction. I mean, I get asked all the time, oh, well, like, you know, how is this any different than just what progressives would say? And I think you just put your finger on it, which is that the pro-business, pro-growth side of this is incredibly important. The idea that, you know, other things equal, tax cuts, nobody begrudges somebody getting a tax cut. No, there's no point in sort of raising taxes just to sort of stick it to somebody, which I think is a much more kind of popular approach in at least some columns of the left. And so ultimately, I think what it comes down to is trade-offs. That if you have, you know, if you have a $2 trillion deficit, that causes a lot of other problems, including in the ability to reshore manufacturing at the end of the day. And so those are the things that have to be balanced. But I'm glad we have you to sort of describe the more optimistic case, because otherwise it's just people listening to me describe the pessimistic case, and then they turn off the podcast. And I think you're describing exactly right what the upside case is and why people, I think, are rightfully, you know, quite enthusiastic about where we could be headed. The recession point is super interesting though, and it gets at the last thing I really wanted to ask you about, which is, you know, especially on these kind of trade and immigration questions, I've been genuinely appalled by the way economists have just run to these claims that, you know, this is all going to be inflationary. This is how many $1,000s a year. This is going to cost a household. You know, this is how regressive is. Like, all of these things that could be equally said about all of their favorite policies, by the way. But like I must have missed the giant carbon tax discussion about all of these exact points. You know, let alone like every regulation any Democrat has ever proposed, which you could also say the same thing about. And it's just, it is so appallingly pretextual in its attempt to just link these policies that the economists don't like to this thing they think people don't like. That being said, I think there is a serious and credible case to be made that, you know, tariffs, immigration restriction, especially in the short run, these things aren't free. You know, people will notice in various ways. And my hypothesis has always been, and this is another thing we just did surveying on recently, that if you actually talk honestly about it, people are actually okay with and even, you know, willing to embrace trade-offs. That particularly after a few decades of being told there are no trade-offs, it's just all upside, and learning that that's code for this is really good for some other people and not for you at all. Somebody saying, no, let us explain to you what is actually going to happen here is sort of inherently preferable, because no trade-off just codes as, oh, I'm the one who's going to get screwed. But also that it's sort of very much in the American tradition to talk honestly in our politics about here is a major challenge, and, you know, to be cliched about it, ask what you can do for your country in a sense. And when we surveyed this, it was wildly popular with, interestingly, everybody except those affluent liberal women who do not want to hear this at all. And even better, we then asked a follow-up question. If you don't want to hear that, why not? And there were different options, right? There was like, well, I just don't believe the politicians. They're just, they're just going to do this for themselves. There was, I don't actually believe that we have a problem that we need to do this for. And then we had one option was, I agree, but I don't want to be the one who sacrifices. My life is hard enough already. And we put that, where this story is going. We put that option in to, see if working lower class voters particularly chose it. They did not. Virtually every group, if they didn't like the message, it was because they didn't trust politicians. And the exception was the middle and upper class, white, very progressive women who said that they disagree because their life is hard enough already. And so that's fine. But, like I said, we value all opinions here on the American Compass podcast. But the point is that almost everyone else said, like, yes, I like this as a message. And especially striking to me, we tested support for tariffs, both described as this incredible opportunity to create great jobs and so forth, and as part of the sacrifice frame that, there are real costs associated with this. But after 20 years of horrible policy, this is what it's going to take to turn things around. And tariffs were much more popular when presented in that latter frame. And so that gives me some hope, although conversely, it doesn't seem to be something that any politician actually believes they should get up and say. That's an incredibly meandering preamble to the actual question, which is, what is your perception of what the actual audience for these kinds of policies makes of the existence of these trade-offs and the willingness to tolerate them?
It's just so funny. I just, the struggle of the affluent 70-year-old progressive woman who can no longer get the abortion she might need. You know what I mean?
Well, to be fair, what we're talking about is the not finding as cheap a nanny. That is at the heart
Right.
of the liberal struggle.
The hardship, right? I think a few things. So, it's funny. The first person to make this argument to me was a woman in my book named Linda, who drives a truck for Amazon in West Virginia. At some point, we were talking about, tariffs and inflation, and she said to me, it costs a lot to bring things back here. Like, yeah, you could get, she didn't use this language, but like you can get Uyghur slaves to make things in Xinjiang, but then you got to get them back here. And the economists never seem to factor that in when they're talking about these price fluctuations, right? If we bring manufacturing back here, it doesn't make up for all of it, but there are costs associated with making things in other places and bringing them back here that they somehow never take into account. I think the perfect example is steel and aluminum, which of course I learned from you about this, but you were the first one to point this out, that when Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from China, every economist said, toasters are going to cost $300. Like no one's going to be able to afford anything.
We won't have toast, Batya. What will we do without toast?
The hardship, Oren. And of course, for about 4 months, the price of steel and aluminum went up, and then it came right back down to where it had been before the tariffs, because there is a very healthy, capitalistic, free market within the United States, which brought those prices right back down while maintaining the average wages of a steel worker, $88,000 a year. And by the way, these are not union jobs because most of them are in the South in right-to-work states. So I think that, there's something that feels truthy about the idea that, tariffs are like unbelievably inflationary, that none of us can afford to buy the product of American workers, that, when you look at individual examples, it just breaks down, But also, even if it is the case, yeah, things are going to be more expensive, some things, but what is more important for our fellow Americans, our neighbors, to be able to afford a home and healthcare and an education for their kids and to retire in dignity, or for us to be able to get a new flat screen TV every year, right? The trade-off here is not exactly like the things that are being compared are not the same. The people who are going to have to make the sacrifices are not the same. I think your survey's fine. What most working people know to be true, which is they want their neighbors to be prosperous so their children can play with them in a nice neighborhood, right? Like they want there to be this sort of basic level of security. And consuming cheap things is not an inherent part of that, but being able to own a home and live in a safe neighborhood and get your kids educated and have adequate health care and retire in dignity, that stuff is really important. So there are things that are sort of like expendable. Sure, it would be nice to have cheap goods, right? And then there are things that are non-expendable. So I don't even think that we're comparing apples and oranges. We don't all need to get a new car every 5 years, you know? And so I think, you know, that's a really important piece of the puzzle here when we're thinking about like who is bearing the costs of these things and who is it being imposed upon.
Yeah, Mike Lind wrote a really excellent piece focusing on this exact point that what the economists will say is, well, the tariff is regressive. A higher share of the cost is going to be paid. Lower income households pay a higher share of their income if you raise these kinds of prices. And what he said is the progressivity or regressivity of the tax code isn't an end unto itself. We don't try to make the progressive the tax code as progressive as we can because that's somehow an inherently important part of a good society. We do it to make up for all of the ways the crappy economy is doing the reverse. And so if you have a policy that is going to have the effect of making the economy more equal and just, saying, well, that's not good because it's not progressive enough is bizarre and entirely behind the point. It's sort of how warped our thinking about all of this has become, that the non-negotiable starting point has to be that we are going to have this warped economic model that does leave most people behind. And if you assume that's the case, then shame on you for proposing a regressive tax. And then you say, but wait a minute, what if we had a better economy? Is that something we can consider? And it's just not even, it's certainly not something the economists even attempt to model as they continue to insist that free trade with China has made us all better off. And it's not something our political system has the ability to even think that way is sort of atrophied. But I think in many ways, sort of, back toward where we started, that's sort of a lot of the optimistic case for what a Trump administration and a Trump-led policymaking process starts to turn around. It is a completely different way of approaching a lot of these problems, and one I think that in a lot of cases is a lot healthier. So that is my optimistic attempt.
I'm glad we got you there.
No, at some point I always think of one nice thing. My mom always said, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. And then I was just a very quiet child. And so she tried to modify that somehow. And here I am hosting a podcast. So it came out okay. Give us your closing thing you are looking for over between now and the inauguration, in a sense. Something you hope to see people focusing on, talking about more than they otherwise might.
I think this is a little off topic, but I think more than any specific policy, Trump, by all accounts right now is the best version of himself. And I just want to see him addressing the American people as one. And I want to see him recognizing what his achievement actually was, which was exactly like you said, depolarization. I would love for him to address the American people from that persona of his, which I've seen before, and to see him step into the magnanimity that the moment calls for. I'm trying to do that as, it's funny because when election night started, I was convinced Harris was going to win just because everyone on CNN was in such a good mood. I thought for sure they know something I don't know. And so I had to sort of develop this whole personality around losing graciously and being a uniter, not a divider. And then lo and behold, 11 p.m. and we were winning, and so I had to somehow remember how to win gracefully. And so I think, both, I'm looking, to President-elect Trump and also to myself to sort of develop really to invest in these these aspects of our personalities where we can, I keep trying to tell, liberals, I know you feel really disappointed, but you're going to be very happy. And I really hope that he, you know, doesn't make me regret saying that. What about you? What are you looking to in the next few weeks?
Oh, my answer is much wonkier. I'm eagerly following all of the tea leaves on appointments and once I believe it's fairly confirmed at this point it'll be a Republican House and Senate, but what that means for additional legislative priorities, what that means for a reconciliation bill, everybody's sort of trying to get in position and more so than in a lot of administrations at this point. I think there are just a lot of different paths it could go down. So what happens now is really going to dictate what the 4 years can and will be. And so I'm never optimistic, but I'm hopeful that certainly compared to 2016, there are a lot more people ready to go in and do a lot of really good work. And so at the margin, every time another one goes in, I become a little bit more optimistic about what we might achieve. So I guess we will have to reconvene in 6 months. We'll see who was right and who was wrong about what. We can laugh at each other. And until
Sounds
then,
like a plan.
Batya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And also a special thank you for your Twitter feed because I absorb a lot of barbs from, the egghead class that got us into this situation for daring to, say that, immigration suppresses working class wages and so forth. But then I just have to go to your Twitter feed and I see you just like an assassin, just picking them off one by one. So thank you very much for that. God bless you for all of the work that you've done to create this incredible policy agenda and to educate people like me and JD Vance and future leaders who will really make this country more fair and more just. Thank you so much, Oren. God bless.
Well, you are very kind. Thank you for all the work you are doing in bringing this message out, in bringing back to us the message from the rest of the country and making it all legible. I think we're getting somewhere, and we will talk about it more next week on the next episode of the American Compass podcast.